Reflect. Snow White Retold. A tale in the Romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Guinevere whirled around in panic when her door slammed. The whir of doves in flight signaled the departure of her friends. She envied them their easy escape. "He's finally gone mad," Xylander said. He strode across the room to close and bar the shutters, engulfing them both in gloom. "You're not safe here anymore." Guinevere pressed a hand to her chest, trying to still her racing heart. She managed a weak smile. "We're his only children. He wouldn't hurt us." Not even she believed it. Or why would she panic so at the slamming of a door? Xylander shook his head. "You didn't hear him, Gin. He's been trying to arrange marriages for us both. He said if the king you're supposed to marry won't agree on your dowry, he'll cut off your head and hands and send them to him instead." A jest, surely. "He sent for the master-at-arms, demanding his axe, Gin." "That was no jest. You must flee." Xylander pressed something into her hands. Sackcloth, it felt like. "Fill this with everything you wish to take with you. I recommend you wear something sturdy and warm, suitable for rough travel, and fill the sack with your court clothes and what jewels you can carry." She had precious few of those, seeing as her father didn't allow her in court. She had no jewels to speak of, for those that had belonged to her mother had been claimed by her stepmother. As for rough travel, why, she hadn't left the castle grounds in months. The roughest travel she'd known in years was to get a stone in her slipper on the way to the cathedral as she crossed the square. "Xylander, I can't." He gripped her shoulders. "We must. I will come with you to protect you, Gin, and see you safely to your new kingdom. You will be a queen, just like Mother was." Her little brother protecting her. A few years ago it would have been a funny notion, but Xylander had become a man while she became a mouse. "What will we eat? Where will we sleep?" she asked. And what would become of the castle in her absence? She'd been chatelaine since her mother's death. "We will bring as much food as we can carry in our saddlebags, and I can hunt along the way. I will pitch you a hunting camp as comfortable as your tower room here, I promise." She wanted to believe him. Oh, the comfort was likely a lie, for nothing beat her feather bed atop its straw mattress, though the straw was wearing thin now. They must be due to be refilled, something else she'd planned to do this week. Could she trust the maids to do the work without her? No, it was her brother she would have to trust, because she'd be leaving the beds and the maids behind. She did believe Xylander about the hunting part, for the guards had taken to calling him Xylander the huntsman, and the bards told stories of his victories on feast days. When her father allowed it, of course. More and more often lately, he'd roar at the bard for getting some detail wrong, and send the poor man out of the hall for a flogging. Come to think of it, there hadn't been any bard at the last feast she'd been allowed to attend. Even the traveling minstrels had stayed clear, not willing to risk being flogged to death for some imagined slight. Xylander was right. Her heart knew it, but her head had just needed a moment to catch up. "Bring me boy's garb. Something your squire would wear, so that when we ride out of the gates together, no one will think to look twice at me," Guinevere said. She thought a moment, then added, "Don't forget a cloak, for if I must look like a queen when we arrive, I cannot cut my hair, and I will need a cloak to cover it." Xylander nodded. "I had thought to wait for nightfall, but if you wear a disguise, we can leave sooner. You are as brave as you are wise, sister. Any kingdom would be blessed to have you as their queen." He hurried out. Guinevere let herself sag against the shuttered window. She would have to be a fool to try and flee from her father, who would send his troops out in search of his lost children. But she would rather take her chances with bandits on the road, than wait for the axe to fall here. A fool she might be, but she'd be a bigger fool if she stayed. 2. An owl screeched in the night, warning invaders out of its territory. Guinevere jumped. What was that? Her round eyes reflected the firelight, making her look like an owl herself. Xylander fought not to laugh. Just a barn owl. I thought you liked birds. She pulled her cloak more closely around her and lay down again. I do. I just never heard one scream like that. It sounds like that poor woman last week, when father overturned the soup pot in his fury and scolded the cook. She shivered. Poor Guinevere. With their older brother, Lubos, riding around the kingdom doing his best to rule in father's stead, and Xylander out hunting as often as he could, she alone had borne the brunt of their father's rages, along with her duties as castle chatelaine, for their stepmother hadn't the slightest idea how to run a castle. You'll be safe inside the walls of your own castle before father finds out you're gone, and not even he will be mad enough to go to war to get you back, Xylander said. She rolled onto her side so she faced him. Where are we going, Lander? To the court of King Artorius in Castrum. His fortress city is nigh on impregnable, and his knights are the finest anywhere. Father offered him your hand in marriage, so it will not seem strange for you to arrive. Xylander hesitated, but he had to tell her the rest, so he continued. Artorius has a daughter but no sons, so he demanded that father betroth me to his daughter by way of alliance instead. Father wants the girl to come here to make me his heir and unite the two kingdoms. Artorius wants me to go there, to marry the girl and become king. But Lubos is the eldest and father's heir. Guinevere protested. Father has gone mad, like I said. Xylander said, throwing a stick at the fire. So you're taking me to Artorius so you can claim your bride? Then what? She asked. Xylander shook his head. Once you are safely crowned, then I can disappear. I have no desire to be king of anywhere, Gin. You know that. I've always left the kingly things to Lubos because that's his destiny, not mine. I wish I'd been born a knight or some nobleman, so that I might spend my days hunting. You must call me Lander or Sir Lander, and if anyone asks, I am your protector, your father's sworn knight. Not a prince. And what about the girl? The princess? Guinevere pressed. He would stay as far away from her as possible. Xylander forced himself to shrug. A marriageable girl, whose dowry comes with a whole kingdom, shouldn't be so difficult to deal with, even if she's a Gorgon. Find her a more suitable match than me. I'd suggest Lubos, but he had his heart set on some baron's daughter last time I looked. You'll be her stepmother, so marriage alliances are well within your power to make. Or perhaps she has her own ideas. If she's anything like you, I'm sure she will. Even if she was still the loveliest woman in the world, nothing would induce Xylander to marry the girl, because her dowry came with a king's crown he had no desire to wear. Better to believe her a Gorgon, and never see her again. Worry not about the girl or anything else, he said. As your brother and your knight protector, I swear on my life I will see that you are safe before I leave you. You will never have to face father and his axe. She sighed. Then you should sleep too, for you will need to be well rested if we must ride to the next kingdom. She patted the blanket beside her. Better than sleeping on the floor of my tower room, just like you said. She smiled at her own joke, making light of her discomfort. Xylander shook his head. I cannot. Someone must stand watch, and even if I wanted to, I could not sleep, knowing you are in danger. And whenever he closed his eyes, his imagination showed him her headless, handless corpse. Better to stay awake all night than think of such things. I thought you'd say that. So I brought you an apple. She held it out. I've enchanted it so that a single bite will give you a night of dreamless sleep. Even a man of your size. He took the apple, thanking her for the gift as he tucked it away for later. Much later, when they had reached Castrum and he could finally sleep soundly. If they reached Castrum. Xylander waited for Guinevere to fall asleep before he banked the fire, hiding its light so that no one would see them from the road. She'd taken such good care of him after their mother died, it was time he repaid the favor. 3. They arrived at Castrum in the late afternoon, not long before the city gates closed at sunset. Xylander insisted on sleeping the night at an inn before entering Artorius's court, and Guinevere was grateful. A bath and a bed for the night after such a wearying journey was just what she needed. The sounds of the city woke her at dawn, and she had never been one to lie abed when there was work to be done. She unbraided her hair, still slightly damp from its washing last night, and combed it until it was dry. Without a maid to help her and only her blurred reflection in the scratched bronze mirror to guide her, Guinevere knew better than to attempt to dress her own hair as would be expected at her father's court. She changed into a fresh shift, then laid out her dresses to see if anything would suit. She'd rolled them all together in the saddlebag, so the silks and linens were now hopelessly creased, but the one woolen gown she'd tightly rolled in the heart of the bundle had not suffered the same fate. The white lamb's wool smoothed out at a touch, its softness strange under her fingers after so long wearing rough squire's clothes. By all that's holy, Gin, put some clothes on. You're haloed against the firelight, and though you might look heaven sent to any other man like that, heaven knows I don't want to see my sister naked. The sight of Xylander with an arm thrown over his eyes as if to block out the morning light, brought laughter to her lips as it lightened her heart. She slipped the white gown over her head as she said, "So you think King Artorius will be willing to marry me?" "Any man would be willing to marry you," Xylander said. "Except me, of course." "Of course." She tied her laces, then adjusted her girdle so it sat right. "Do I look good enough for court, Lander?" "If there is a man among them who dares say otherwise, I shall challenge them on the spot," he said, filling the basin with water and dunking his head in. He came up spluttering. "And fight for your honor." She snorted. "What good would it do for you to get stuck on a sword?" He drew himself up haughtily. "I am an expert swordsman. In the battle for your honor, it will be the other man who is pierced by my blade. Even worse. I'm sure Artorius will really want to marry me, knowing it's my fault one of his knights was slayed for simply slighting me." Xylander rubbed his face vigorously with a towel, then blinked at her. "A truly noble king would recognize the loyalty you command in your men, and be even more eager for an alliance. Do you think father will honor such an alliance?" Xylander's wince answered for him. They ate a silent breakfast, and all too soon made their way up the spiraling streets to the castle. 4. At this early hour, father's court would have been empty, but King Artorius evidently rose early and everyone knew it. Xylander wished he'd known it, as he craned his neck over the crowd to the throne on the dais. Yes, there was a man sitting on it, who surely must be the king. "All of the women wear veils here," Guinevere hissed, looking stricken. Xylander shrugged. What did it matter if she covered her hair or not? The party of merchants currently petitioning the king bowed and moved out of the way. Xylander straightened. There they were, Artorius's famous knights. Each clad in a different surcoat, emblazoned with the symbols that were as legendary as the men themselves. He'd heard they stood as equals in Artorius's court, but every group had a leader, the first among equals, and the first among them was the man wearing an azure surcoat, emblazoned with a sword in either silver or white. It was hard to tell at this distance. "I'll go speak to the herald, so he can announce you," Xylander said, squeezing inside the crowded hall. He might not be dressed in his princely best, but the sword on his hip proclaimed he was wealthier than most of the peasants hoping to be heard today, and the crowd parted for him. He took his time scanning the court, taking in as much as he could, before giving Guinevere's name to the herald. Then he hurried back to her. "The king is old, older than father," he murmured in her ear. "Gin, I don't think he wants a bride. We may have to go somewhere else." Where would you have me go? No, Lander, Castrum is strong enough to withstand an attack, even from father's armies. I'm not leaving here. From the set of her chin, he knew it would be futile arguing with her. An idea came to him. If he refuses you, ask to marry one of his knights. They are all of noble blood, and any one of them will protect you with his life. Xylander grasped her arm. You will be much happier with some handsome knight than a white-haired old king, Gin. She shook him off. Don't be daft. Father betrothed me to the king, or tried to, and I will honor his offer. Just because a man is handsome doesn't make him a good husband. Xylander tried again. Yes, but... Her Royal Highness Princess Guinevere of Flamand, the herald boomed. Xylander's heart sank. 5. Guinevere heard her name, but the roaring in her ears blocked out everything else. A path opened up before her, walled with people on either side, and she marched forward, her head held high. Every woman wore a veil, she was the only one with her head uncovered. And why had she chosen to wear white? Artorius's court all wore dark sombre colors, making her look as out of place as snow in summer. Yet the wall of humanity wilted as she passed, bows and curtsies, as one would expect for a princess. The only ones who remained standing were a crowd of men off to the side of the king's dais. They looked like knights tricked out for a tourney with their brightly colored surcoats. Every one of them stared avidly at her. She did her best to ignore them, and curtsied deeply at the foot of the king's dais. Princess Guinevere of Flamand. What brings you to Castrum? She looked up, fixing her eyes on the king's bushy white raised eyebrows. I have come to offer myself in marriage, to forge an alliance between our two countries. The eyebrows bunched, almost meeting in the middle. I told your father I have no need for another bride. I will send you home with an honor guard. He motioned toward the knights. Lancelot, assemble a squad of your best men. You shall escort the princess home to Flamand, and you shall tell King Ludgar. No. Guinevere held up her hand to stop the king, and found she had stopped the bright blue knight too, whose sword-emblazoned surcoat stood mere inches from her hand. She met the knight's eyes and was surprised to find they matched his surcoat, despite his dark hair. A knight in her father's court would have ducked his head instantly, knowing he was not worthy to read the princess's soul. But this knight held her gaze with a mix of curiosity and approval. You will be much happier with some handsome knight, the memory of her brother's voice whispered. He was so handsome, just looking at him made her heart sing, this blue knight. But no amount of singing would keep her safe. Only the king could do that. No, King Artorius. I did not undertake the perilous journey from my father's kingdom to yours only to fail in my quest now. My father does not forgive failure. No matter how many knights you send, they will not be able to protect me from my father's wrath. I am a dutiful daughter and I will be wed. Or she had been a dutiful daughter until now. Damn father for driving her to this. A tear slipped down her cheek, and her voice dropped to a whisper. Please, your majesty, do not send me back. Silence fell before the whispering began. Guinevere held the king's gaze, letting her eyes speak for her. Help me, please. Come, princess. Artorius extended a hand toward her, palm up, while he waved away the blue knight with the other. Come and sit beside me. She grasped the king's hand and rose. He guided her to the throne beside his, the queen's throne, and made her sit. Then he called for the next petitioner. Numbly, Guinevere sat beside him, only half listening to the endless stream of petitions and the judgments Artorius made. The words washed over her, but some things she did notice. Unlike her father, Artorius never raised his voice or lost his temper. The Blue Knight never took his eyes off her. And at the end of the audience, when Artorius rose to dismiss his court, he still kept hold of her hand. 3 days hence there will be a celebratory feast to mark the marriage of 2 kingdoms, when I will take Princess Guinevere as my bride, Artorius announced. Guinevere almost cried with relief but managed to restrain herself, for she felt everyone's eyes upon her. Everyone but the Blue Knight, who suddenly found the flagstones at his feet far more fascinating. 6. Xylander headed back to the inn, thinking to collect his things and ride away. Now Guinevere was safe, he could be on his way. Find his own destiny, so to speak, as far from his father as possible. Is she fair, the princess? The fairest lady I have ever seen. Skin white as fresh fallen snow, lips as red as blood. Xylander grinned. Guinevere didn't think she had any beauty to speak of, but she'd turned every head in court today, male and female alike. She'd been wasted, shut up in father's castle. Here, she would be allowed to bloom. Or at least he hoped so. Perhaps he should stay for a little while, just to see how her marriage suited her. He owed her that. And hair as black as ebony. The prettiest princess you ever saw, with a heart so soft, she covers her face and weeps at the sight of blood. They weren't talking about Guinevere. Xylander had seen his sister hawking with their mother, and when her falcon had brought her a duck or a fat pigeon, she'd snapped their necks like any born hunter. Quick, decisive, yet without cruelty or enjoyment, heedless of the blood on her hands from the wounds the falcon's talons had gouged in her prey. Even on the day Mother's Gyr falcon, Circe, had sliced through Mother's glove and drawn blood, Guinevere had held her head high, taking the bird from Mother before cleaning and bandaging Mother's arm. He'd wished for Guinevere the first and last time he'd come to Castrum. A time best forgotten. When she takes her place as queen, then we will truly know peace. Xylander choked back a laugh. A leader who could not stand the sight of blood would not be strong enough to maintain any kind of peace. You dare laugh at our future queen, a cool voice demanded. Xylander blinked, realizing the merchant was addressing him. Evidently he hadn't choked back his laughter soon enough. It takes a strong leader to ensure peace. One like King Artorius. He's taking a new wife soon, who may yet give him a son. If she does, the princess will never be queen. The merchant shook his head pityingly. You know little of our king, sir. He has not taken another wife because he means to see Princess Xylander inherit his throne. The only son he wants is a son-in-law, a fitting consort for the princess, but no man is good enough. Xylander opened his mouth to say that Artorius had thought he was good enough, then snapped it shut again. He was pretending to be a knight, not a prince. And he did not want their ebon-haired princess, who would never want to come hunting with him. He imagined her as a dark rain cloud, raining tears too often. Instead he said, the new queen is fair. Fair of eye and hair and skin. Why, it might be said she is fairer than Princess Xylander. With a wife so fair, surely the king will not be able to resist begetting a son. Several, maybe. One man slammed his empty cup down on the table. Princess Xylander is the fairest maiden in the land, and I will fight any man who says otherwise. Xylander reached for his sword. Princess Guinevere is fairer, and I will answer such an insult with my blade. He had barely a moment to think that perhaps Castrum was worth staying in, after all, if it was to be this much fun, before the brawl began in earnest, and he found himself in the middle of the best fight he'd had in years. 7. The white silk. His Majesty commands it. The whirl of activity around Guinevere ceased, and the maids fell silent. Judging by the quality of her dress, the noblewoman who spoke of silk was some relation to the king. But Guinevere had been her father's chatelaine for too many years to be cowed by a commanding tone, and here she would be queen. White silk is impractical, and nothing like I saw the women wearing in court. Something darker would be much more sensible. The king commands that his bride will be wed in white. His queen will stand out in court, no matter what she wears, for you will sit beside him. The woman's stubborn chin jutted out as she matched Guinevere's gaze, then bobbed the slightest bit in a mocking curtsy. "Your Highness." "Yes, Lady Ragnar," the maids chorused. The maids bustled about her with the white silk, ignoring Guinevere's quiet protests. "Your veil will be embroidered with gold thread, the same shade as your hair," Lady Ragnar continued. "I will see to it myself." And with that she turned in a swirl of skirts and was gone, but for the clinking of the keyring at her girdle as she marched down the corridor. The castle chatelaine, Guinevere guessed. One who already grasped the reins of the household firmly in hand. With such a woman already here, perhaps Guinevere could sit around in white silk, embroidering handkerchiefs or whatever took her fancy, for she would have little else to do. A situation as alien to her as the surface of the moon, for even when her mother was alive, Guinevere had been learning how to keep a castle. For her mother had often said a king might rule a kingdom, but it was the queen who ruled the castle, and to do that she must know everything that went on within it, to make sure it ran as smoothly as possible. Yet Castrum coped fine without a queen. Castrum was shaping up to be a very different place to home, she reflected. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad one. Then again, in her 2 days in Castrum, no one had shouted at her, threatened to kill her, or brought her an impossible problem and begged her to solve it. Perhaps she could learn to like it here. White silk, idleness and all. 8. The wedding was a mercifully brief affair, so unmemorable that even after, as she sat on the Queen's throne beside Artorius in court, nodding her gratitude for the endless stream of wedding gifts being presented by his vassals, the only details she could recall were about the cathedral. Older than the one at home, an altar before which they'd said their vows sat beneath a circular dome that appeared to be a giant caricature of the bishop's bald head below it. Firmly yet with great courtesy, Artorius took her hand to guide her from cathedral to throne room and then on to the feasting hall, where he seated her beside him on the dais. A girl close to her own age sank onto the bench beside Guinevere. A girl who wore white silk, just like her. Guinevere opened her mouth to greet the girl. "Princess, you have not yet congratulated your father and his new bride," said a male voice from the girl's other side. Guinevere found herself impaled by the girl's gimlet glare, as the girl pursed her lips into a disapproving rosebud. "She's wearing my silk. I can't help but wonder what else she means to usurp while she's here. I can't imagine what my father was thinking." The man leaned forward, his eyes bulging as they avidly regarded Guinevere. She'd never minded people staring at her before, but the touch of this man's eyes made her skin crawl. She wanted to bathe all over again, scrubbing fiercely until she could no longer feel it. His tongue darted out, licking plump lips. He was thinking like a man. A man with needs that must be met. Needs that only a wife can truly satisfy. "I'm sure when you are a wife, you will understand. If you had but accepted my offer, tonight could have been a double celebration, and I would only be too happy to educate you in all your wifely duties. Just say the word, princess." Though the lecherous man spoke to the princess, his eyes were undressing Guinevere. Like Artorius would, after the feast, in the privacy of his bedchamber. Her wedding night. Guinevere shivered. She had heard many tales about what happened, both bad and good, and she prayed she would not embarrass herself or her new husband. That would be enough. To hope for the pleasure she'd heard some women experienced in the bedchamber, no, that was too much to hope for. "Lord Melwis, I would not marry you if you were the last man on earth. My father has promised I shall marry a prince, and I am content to wait until he comes to claim me. On that day I will celebrate." The girl drank deeply from her wine. Guinevere smothered a laugh. Artorius's daughter might not like her, but she quite liked the daughter. Guinevere vowed to help the girl marry her prince, if that's what she wanted. Perhaps the girl might come to like her if she could arrange it. 9. As a mere knight, Xylander sat far to the back of the hall, where the men ate off trenchers instead of plates. Not that he minded the plain fare, he'd eaten plenty such on hunting trips. As long as there was plenty of it, and there was. King Artorius kept a good table. Up at the high table Guinevere sat like a marble statue come to life. Her veil hid her golden hair, but he'd know his sister anywhere. She was born to be a queen. The men around him toasted the health of their new queen and the king, until they toasted more for another drink than whatever they were well-wishing. Xylander downed his drink, and decided to risk it. Artorius was busy talking to the man beside him, so Xylander could pretend to be as drunk as his fellows, and approach the dais to wish the couple well. The king would likely ignore him as he should to some drunken junior knight, but Guinevere would appreciate it, and she was the one who mattered. Xylander wove between tables revelers and servers, his eyes fixed on Guinevere. She caught sight of him and flashed a smile that spoke more of hope than happiness. A hope for happiness, perhaps. He should have been watching where he was going. He smacked into someone, nearly knocking the slight figure down. He reached out to steady her and found his hands ensnared in silk. Only then did he drag his eyes from Guinevere to meet hers. Dark eyes peered up at him, shocked. Xylander ducked his head, praying she would not recognize him if she hadn't yet already. If she knew him as the Green Knight, he'd be dead for sure. "Please forgive me, sweet lady." He bowed low. She made a disapproving sound deep in her throat. In a rustle of silk, she was gone. Xylander dared to breathe again, only to inhale her dizzying scent. Something sweet and floral, enchanting him even more. Rough hands seized his arms as a red-faced courtier took her place before him. "How dare you touch the princess," the courtier hissed. He'd hoped to find her a gorgon, but her beauty had bloomed since he'd seen her last. Princess Xyrine was as beauteous as Guinevere, if not more. It mattered not. She'd seen his hideous defeat in that tourney years ago, and wouldn't want anything to do with him. Better that he leave. Now. Before she remembered, and sent more guards after him than these two. Xylander twisted out of their hold and hurried out of the hall. 10. "Come, wife, it is time to take you to my chamber," Guinevere heard Artorius say, and his hand engulfed hers. She wiped her lips to hide their trembling, then let the cloth fall as Artorius led her away from the high table. Guinevere held her head high as a queen should, marching with firm steps behind her new king, hoping no one could see the tumult inside. The sheer terror at what was to come. Someone fell into step behind her. She glanced back, hoping to meet Xylander's gaze so that the eye contact might bolster her courage, but she found one of Artorius's knights following her instead. The knight bowed his head rather than meet her eyes, but it didn't stop her from recognizing him. This was the azure knight who'd stared at her so when she first entered Artorius's court. Up close and in his wedding finery, he cut an even finer figure than before. For one mad, glorious moment, she wished she could have married the handsome knight instead of his king, so that her wedding night might feel like more of a pleasure than a duty. But a lone knight could not protect her from her father's forces if her father came after her, while King Artorius could command armies of strong knights. The price of protection was to share the king's bed. A price she had promised to pay, and she would. "Your chamber, my queen," King Artorius said, opening a door and ushering her inside. He did not miss her hesitation. He clapped a hand on the knight's shoulder. "This is Sir Lancelot, the most loyal of my knights. There is no man I trust more to guard the door of my chamber or yours." Lancelot dropped to one knee, accepting her hand from his king. "I am honored, your majesties." His lips touched the back of Guinevere's hand. She gasped as lightning seemed to spark at his touch, running up her arm into the very heart of her. She darted a frightened glance at the king, hoping he hadn't seen. But of course he had, for he watched her closely. "You have nothing to fear while Sir Lancelot protects you, my queen," Artorius said. "Now step inside while I have a word with him." She had no choice but to obey her husband, no matter how much she felt the urge to run. A foolish urge, she told herself, as she entered the royal bedchamber. She spied the chest that was evidently used to store their crowns and breathed a sigh of relief. Never had something weighed her down as much as the circlet of gold atop her head, and she felt so much lighter as she laid the queen's crown in its proper place. She must have unfastened the fillet that held her veil in place too, for she felt the fabric slide down her back into a pile on the floor. She nudged the richly embroidered cloth with her slippered foot. Hours of work had gone into every stitch in anticipation of this day, and now the day was over, she had no desire to take it up again. She heard a gasp and turned to find both Sir Lancelot and King Artorius staring at her. Lancelot ducked his head. "To my last breath, your majesty." Another clap to the knight's shoulder. "Good boy." From the furrow in the knight's brow, Guinevere judged he did not agree with his sovereign, but he had the grace not to say so. She wouldn't have called Lancelot a boy either, he was most definitely a man, yet she had no desire to argue with her new husband. She would struggle enough to be meek and compliant. By all that was holy, why had she agreed to? The door clicked shut, and Artorius slammed the bar into place, barring the chamber to all but themselves. There would be no escape now. Guinevere swallowed back her terror. It had no place here. The king smiled. "Your hair is like spun gold. You will need to cover it in court, or you will blind my men with your beauty." She bobbed a curtsy. "Yes, your majesty." For all she'd been taught about protocol and the proper things a wife did for her husband, she could not for the life of her remember how she was supposed to address him. He dropped his crown into the chest. "Artorius, please. Or just Art if you wish. Titles are for court or the battlefield, and you have no need to be present at either, if you do not wish it. Truly I am too old to be breaking in a new wife, but I could never refuse aid to a damsel in distress. Now we are alone, tell me truly, Guinevere, is this the fate you would have chosen? Better than the alternative. Yes, your Artorius." He chuckled, but his shrewd old eyes saw too much. "Or at least you fear me less than your father." "I do not fear you." Damn his eyes. "I fear what all new brides do is all." She ducked her head so that she might unlace her gown without him reading her very soul. And rightly so, perhaps. A young man faced with a beautiful woman forgets himself and what is due to his bride, far too often. He glanced at the door, perhaps thinking of Lancelot. A wedding night is only properly consummated when both parties are willing and ready to join together in every way. "I will not ask anything of you unless you are ready, Guinevere." Her gown puddled around her ankles, but the laces on her shift had somehow tied themselves into impossible knots. She dragged the garment up over her head and threw it on the floor. "I am ready." Ignoring how the cool air chilled her skin, she marched to the bed and lay down, closing her eyes tightly. "I am ready," she repeated, as much to herself as to him. She felt his weight as he climbed into the bed beside her. She squeezed her eyes shut tighter, trying to visualize the handsome knight naked. She would imagine he was Lancelot, and the ordeal would be over soon. "Well, I am not," Artorius said. "Drinking all those toasts to our health and happiness, I fear has given me a splitting headache. One that cannot be cured even by the sight of your beautiful body. So cover yourself, my dear, and get some sleep." "I certainly intend to." By all that was holy, no. He could not do this to her. She had the courage for this now, but tomorrow, or another night, who knew if she could summon such courage again? "But if the marriage is not consummated," she began. He cut her off with a loud snore. Guinevere's eyes flew open. The snoring continued. Her husband had fallen asleep, without laying a finger on her. She waited until she was certain he wouldn't wake before she slid beneath the blankets. Obedient wife that she was, she tried to sleep. 11. Guinevere couldn't say what woke her, but as her sleep-fogged mind registered the heavy breathing in the bed beside her, the weight of dread pulled her out from under the covers. The room still held the warmth of last night's fire, now little more than ashes in the hearth she edged toward, but a chill settled over her as she reached for a shift to clothe her nakedness. The white silk gown, puddled where it had fallen, reminded her that she was a new bride, and her heavy-breathing bedmate was her husband, but it couldn't dim her desire to dress before he woke. Only when she'd laced up her lavender linen gown did she dare to approach the bed again on slippered feet. Artorius's eyes opened, but they filled with horror at the sight of her. Guinevere wet her lips. "It is I, Guinevere, your new queen," she said. He flopped like a landed fish, one arm pounding the mattress while the other hung, lifeless, over the edge of the bed. He made a hoarse sound, but there were no words in it. And his face, why, it almost looked like it had drooped all down one side. Apoplexy, Guinevere's mind told her, as her horrified eyes met his. Just like Mother, who had died the day this happened to her. But Artorius couldn't die. He was her husband, he'd promised to protect her. If he died, she'd have to go back home to her father's wrath, or worse, run again. In desperation, she did the only thing she could do. She bit her lip and cast a sleeping spell on the king. A spell strong enough to stop the illness from progressing or at least slow it, yet it put him into a slumber light enough that he still drew breath and appeared to sleep naturally. Outside her chamber, she found the guard had changed, so she did not need to meet the eyes of the handsome man who'd made her heart flutter last night. Instead, the new guard bowed deeply. "Your Majesty." She nodded in acknowledgement and tried to step past him. "How fares the king?" She stopped. "He sleeps still. Last night he was tired and drank a lot of wine." The knight nodded and moved aside. Guinevere considered telling him that the king was not well, but to say the words aloud was to make the king's fate unavoidable. No, she could not tell him. Let the knight find him and a healer who could work miracles that might save him. To lose her husband like she'd lost her mother was a cruel twist of fate she could not bear. It was early yet, so instead of going to the great hall, she headed for the kitchen in search of something with which to break her fast. She followed the yeasty scent of baking bread to the kitchen, then stood in the doorway, admiring the purpose-filled bustle below. In a well-run kitchen such as this, the chatelaine would have little waste to worry about. Why, looking around, you would not guess that a huge feast had been prepared here only yesterday. "Your Majesty?" Lady Ragnar's voice was unmistakable. "The king and his daughter prefer to take breakfast in the great hall. If you tell me what you wish to eat, I shall see that it is brought up to you." Every head turned to stare at her then, before the entire kitchen staff sank into deep curtsies. Her appearance had never stopped all work in the kitchen at home, Guinevere thought wryly. "I will have whatever the others normally have," she said. "Very good, Your Majesty," said Lady Ragnar. Guinevere half expected the woman to pat her on the head, like her nurse had when she was a child. "If you have lost your way, I can show you to the great hall," Lady Ragnar continued, gesturing. Of course. The kitchen staff still hadn't moved. "Please," Guinevere agreed. "Along that passageway, turn right, then follow that to the end, and you shall be in the great hall," Lady Ragnar said, edging between Guinevere and the kitchen. Blocking her way, leaving her no choice but to leave. Guinevere got the message all right. She might be queen, but Lady Ragnar ran the castle. There was no place for a queen in the kitchen. 12. Mark my words, cousin. If your father rises from his bed today, it will be a miracle indeed. Guinevere recognized the sneering voice of the man who'd been sitting beside the princess last night. Instead of continuing into the great hall, she retreated down the corridor, where the shadows would hide her from sight while she could still listen. "If you have poisoned my father, Lord Melwys, I will see you tried and executed for treason." He will rise as readily as he has every other morning." That was the princess. Guinevere's blood ran cold. What did Melwys know about the king's condition? Could the man have poisoned his king somehow? But how would he have known to give him a poison to make his death look like mother's? "Oh, not me, dear cousin. I would not dream of poisoning the king. That little slut who seduced him into yesterday's farce of a marriage might, though. Probably already pregnant with some other man's bastard, she came here to seduce your father, meaning to set her bastard son upon the throne and act as regent until the boy is of age. For after spending a night with your father, then silencing him before the night is over, who could say that her child is not his?" "She is pregnant?" "How do you know?" the princess asked, sounding wistful. The woman walked into court with her hair uncovered. "You were not there, so you did not see, but ask any lady of the court who was. She walked in with her hair as loose as the devil's own snares, as brazen as the Lord of Hell himself. Only virtuous women wear veils, like your good self. Mark my words, cousin, the king may have laid a crown on the little whore's head, but no mere metal can make her fit to be queen. What can we do? We are strongest together, cousin. You are his only child, and I am his closest male heir. If anything happens to your father, we must marry, for only when we are united can we keep the throne from that slut of a usurper." The princess made a disgusted sound. "I should have known you are full of wind and little else, Lord Melwys. When my father comes to break his fast proving you wrong, I will tell him of your silly stories and your relentless quest for my hand, and he will put an end to them both. Perhaps he will send you to inspect the salt mines on the eastern border, for those lands are yours, are they not? You spend so much time at court, it is difficult to remember you have a home of your own." "You're a fool, Zurine. Once your father is dead, she will come after you." "But if you are so sure you are father's heir, surely she would come after you first?" This time the disgusted sound came from Melwys. "The slut is no match for me, and even she knows that, if you do not. She will choose the easier targets, you and your father, first, and wait for her father's armies to arrive before she even thinks to take me on. I could protect you, but only if you marry me. I'll take my chances, Lord Melwys, and I will take my breakfast alone in my chambers. Talking to you makes me lose my appetite every time." Princess Zurine's footsteps approached. Guinevere sank deeper into the shadows, praying the girl would not see her. 13. Is there a knight called Xylander staying here? All heads in the taproom turned toward the guard who'd spoken, but no one answered. He is needed up at the castle, the guard continued, growing impatient. Tense shoulders relaxed, and most of the men resumed drinking. All but Xylander, who debated whether to answer the summons or flee. If it were his father's summons, fleeing would be the wiser choice. But this was Castrum, not home, and this king had showed no signs of madness. What's he needed for? Xylander called. Now heads turned toward him, out of curiosity more than anything else. In Flamand, dread would have elicited sharp gasps from the men, as they hunched their shoulders in relief that the curse of the king's notice had passed them by. But mad kings were mercifully absent in this kingdom. Xylander rose to his feet and repeated, "Why does the castle need Xylander?" The guard coughed. She did not say. Xylander's heart soared. The princess had discovered his name and summoned him. Of course she would not tell a mere guard what she wanted. Perhaps she had recognized him from before. Had her thoughts been filled with him, like his dreams last night had been haunted by her? Perhaps she'll tell me then, he said. For I am Xylander. He fastened his cloak and followed the guard out. One guard, who made no move to restrain him. This was an invitation, and a polite one at that. He was indeed needed. Perhaps wanted too. People bustled about, paying him no heed as they passed him in the castle corridors. Xylander was led ever upward, to where the royal family's apartments lay, he was certain. Surely he had not made that much of an impression on the princess, that she'd summoned him to her bedchamber. Yet if he had. The guard knocked on a door. "Xylander, mistress," he said, sweeping the door open and gesturing for Xylander to enter. Xylander stepped inside. 14. Finally, Guinevere stopped pacing at the sight of her brother. "Shut the door." Xylander did, looking confused. She didn't give him a chance to ask questions. Not until she told him everything, when she was sure he'd have questions aplenty. "The king took ill last night. Like mother did, on the day she died." Tears itched at the corners of her eyes, but Guinevere drew in a deep breath and blinked them away. "I put him into a healing sleep, but that will only delay the end. Unless some miracle occurs, he will die, and that will leave us worse off than before." Xylander nodded. "The succession here after his death is not so clear. He has one daughter, Princess Urine. Old enough to marry but as yet unwed. His closest male relation is Lord Melwis, a courtier of considerable power, who seeks to cement that by marrying the princess. If he does, he will become king." Guinevere sucked in another breath. "I heard them talking today. They believe I have come here on father's orders to kill them all. The king, the princess, all of them, then claim the throne for myself." Xylander opened his mouth, likely to utter a horrified protest. "They won't let us stay here, Lander. They'll send us home, unless we can find a way to prevent it. Prevent Melwis from becoming the next king." "You want me to kill Lord Melwis then?" Xylander asked. He thought for a moment, then rubbed his hands together. "It will be a simple matter. I shall call him out for speaking ill of the Queen, and when I am victorious, you will be safe. I've sworn to protect you, and if it means killing a man, so be it." If only it were so simple. "No. I need you to take the princess out of the picture." He would say no for certain, but she had to try. "You want me to do what to the princess?" She hushed him. If anyone heard him, word might get back to Melwis that what he'd suspected was true. "I want you to seduce the girl, so she fell in love with Xylander and married him instead of Melwis. Reveal to the princess that he was the prince she longed for, and claim the king's crown." Things Xylander would never agree to, even if it was the only way they could stay here. He wanted to fight and hunt, and never take up his royal duties. As for seducing anyone, he would consider it beneath his honor to do such a thing. How could she word it so he would not refuse? Think of it like a quest. A hunt, if you will, for a pure and elusive creature, who you alone must conquer. You must capture her heart, or all will be lost. Xylander's eyes widened in surprise. "You want her heart?" It sounded so crude put like that, but how else could she say it? "Only if her heart is in your possession, yours and yours alone, will we be able to stay here. You promised to keep me safe, Lander. This is the only way." He swallowed. "I made an oath, and I shall keep it, though it will cost me dearly. It will be as you wish. May heaven forgive me." 15. Guinevere wanted him to kill the princess. Xylander didn't want to believe it, but she would never lie to him about something so serious. So no matter what his feelings were for the lovely princess, he would honor his oath to Guinevere. Because family and honor meant far more than some pretty maiden, princess or no. He would do this one thing for her, then leave Castrum. For with the princess dead, he would have nothing to keep him here. 16. Guinevere took her dinner alone in her chamber, not sure she could face Lord Melwis and his suspicions again. To have come so far and think she was finally safe, only to be cast into a pit of uncertainty again, fate must truly hate her. "Beg pardon, Your Majesty." The guard bowed from the doorway. Guinevere dropped her spoon back into her half-eaten bowl of soup. She had no appetite today anyway. Yes? Your presence is required in the throne room. Was the Queen expected to dispense justice in the absence of the king? She had little experience in such things, but she would do her duty if she must. She rose and followed the guard. Heavens, did she look queenly enough to sit in judgment? She'd never had to worry much about her appearance back home. The maids had obeyed her orders whether she appeared immaculate or covered in dust with straw in her hair. Well, she hadn't touched any straw today, so a quick pat told her that her hair was fine. A glance down her front confirmed that she hadn't spilled her soup. The lacings on her bodice sat straight and firmly tied, though she tugged on them just to make sure. And her slippers were so new she could scarcely feel the flagstones beneath her feet, so there could be no holes. Did she need her crown? She almost turned back to get it, then remembered that it was in the bedchamber she'd shared with Artorius, where he slept still. He had not worn a crown on the day she'd petitioned him. Even if he had, her mother had said many times that a lady of royal blood needed no such thing to proclaim her authority. Everyone should know she was a queen by the way she entered a room or walked through it. Crownless, she would make her mother proud. Guinevere drew herself up, lifting her chin as she straightened her shoulders, looking ahead instead of at the flagstones. When she reached the throne room, she swept in, not waiting to be announced. She reigned here, second only to the king himself, who was not here. The crowd of courtiers parted before her, a sea of bows and curtsies, showing her the way to her throne. One man stood in her way, Sir Lancelot. He met her gaze for only a moment before bowing deeply like the rest, but as he stood on the dais steps, even bent over, he stood higher than she. Your Majesty, we feared that the illness which has struck down the king might have affected you too, but by some miracle you are well. We must be thankful for small mercies. So they knew about the king's illness. She wasn't sure whether his words were meant to trap her into an incriminating response, or if he genuinely meant what he said. His emotionless gaze gave away nothing. Guinevere merely nodded once and ascended to her throne. Lancelot hushed the ill wind of whispering with one hand. Your Majesty, lords and ladies of the court, good knights, some of whom have already heard our ill news. The king's illness was both sudden and unexpected, and has kept him to his bed today. Our best healers are with him and doing everything within their power to see him well again. It's her fault. Guinevere found a pudgy man pointing his finger at her. The other courtiers edged away from him, and she realized this was Lord Melwys. Keep her away from the king or worse will happen. Lancelot put up two placatory hands. Of course, Her Majesty cannot sleep in a sick chamber. A new bride who may well be in a delicate condition should be protected at all costs. We cannot have the Queen and any heir she might be carrying fall ill too. The king would never forgive us. Melwys looked like he had more to say, but he subsided. Nevertheless, Guinevere still felt his eyes upon her, as Lancelot dealt with any urgent matters that could not wait on the king's health. He was as just as the king, declaring his judgment before deferring to her. A nod seemed to suffice, so she did not have to judge cases or say a word the whole time she sat there, yet justice was served all the same. Eventually she began to tire, or perhaps it was boredom weighing down her eyelids, but the thought had barely crossed her mind before Lancelot declared the day's audience at an end. The crowd dispersed, until only she and Lancelot remained. He bowed before the dais. I hope my presumption did not displease you, my queen. It was I who sent the guard to get you, when Lord Melwys summoned the court. If I had not, I fear he would have declared his regency until the king is well again. With you present, he did not dare. Guinevere managed a smile. When the king is well again, I am certain he will be grateful for your care for his kingdom. His eyes met hers, sadness piercing her as surely as his gaze did. Did you not hear, your Majesty? It appears the king is gravely ill, and the healers fear he may not wake at all. Princess Xylander said she would tell you herself, and headed to your chamber to break the news. Did you not see her? Guinevere shook her head. Then a twist of dread tied her stomach in a knot. If Xylander had come while she was speaking to Xylander and heard her. Strange, Lancelot said. Perhaps Her Highness was so overcome by her father's illness that it slipped her mind. I shall speak to her. If Melwys summons the court again, it would be best if both you and the princess could be present. For in the absence of the king, the presence of the two women he loves most would reassure the populace. Love? How could this knight talk of love between her and the husband she did not know? Would never know now. Tears clouded Guinevere's eyes, and this time she could not drive them away. They trickled down her cheeks, twin testaments to her helplessness. I will see that Lady Ragnar is made aware that you are to have your old chambers back. For the king will never forgive me if something were to happen to you. The princess who'd run a whole castle complete with its unpredictable king, now could not even control herself. Oh, how this knight must despise her. But she was his queen for all her weaknesses, and she must act like one. Guinevere found her voice. Thank you, Sir Lancelot, she said. Then she left, to find the safety of her chamber where she might weep in frustration without being watched. 17. Clouds had darkened the day early, so what had been a sunlit room when she left it yesterday was now a place of shadows and deeper darkness with the shutters closed. The newly lit fire didn't help matters, flickering weakly like a dying bird that had fallen down the chimney. A fitting place for Queen Guinevere to sleep tonight, she grumbled to herself as she pushed the door shut behind her. For the first time in her adult life, she wanted to throw herself on the floor and pound the flagstones until her frustration died. To be so close to safety and yet so far. But if she did, the weariness already starting to weight her limbs would overcome her, and the floor was no place for a queen to sleep. Better that she take herself to bed instead, and pound the pillows without hurting her fists. She took a step toward it, before the unfamiliar glitter stopped her. You need the help of a powerful man at court, said a voice that turned her stomach. Melwys. The glitter of his eyes reminded her of a spider in the dark, only his eyes reflecting the firelight as he reclined on her bed. Ugh. She wouldn't beat the pillows. She would burn them. But I am not the altruist that Artorius is, or was, Melwys continued smoothly. A plea for help and a look from those big sad eyes will not be enough to win me over. No, you will need to offer me something of value in exchange for helping you. He rose from the bed, an ungainly maneuver that reminded her of a ballista ball being hefted out of a cartload of straw. A lot of rocking and rolling, puffing and blowing, until the man's feet finally touched the ground. For all his girth, he stood no taller than her. I have nothing to offer you, Guinevere said. She meant it as a polite dismissal. That is not true, he said, taking a step toward her. You have the jewels Artorius gave you as a wedding gift. Princess Xylander was furious when she discovered they were gone. Jewels? The only item of jewelry Artorius had given her was a crown, and he had that still. Guinevere knew only a fool would hand this man a crown, even one fit for a queen. I might accept the jewels as a deposit. The first installment of many, Melwys said. Your father's kingdom has many treasures, so I am sure you have a fat dowry that Artorius will not miss. Guinevere's mouth was too dry to speak. She could hardly tell this man that she'd fled Flamand with little more than a sack of clothing, and her father would probably disown her when he discovered what she'd done if he hadn't already. She squeezed her eyes shut, not wanting to let this man see her cry. He seized her, and when she opened her mouth to scream, he shoved his tongue down her throat, choking her. Thick lips bruised hers, as equally heavy hands kneaded her bottom like she was a loaf of bread he planned to devour. A furious hammering sounded, somewhere far away. Melwis released her, swaying, and she realized someone was knocking at the door. She sucked in a breath and called, "Come in." The door opened. Xylander spilled into the room, his eyes wild. "The princess is gone." "What did you say?" Melwis demanded. Xylander stared at the man, as if he hadn't seen him before. "I said Princess Xurine has disappeared. No one has seen her all day. She's nowhere to be found in the castle." Melwis swore, then hurried out. Guinevere's legs could no longer hold her. She sat heavily on a chest and let her tears fall. "I don't know what to do," she wept. Yet even as she said the words, her mind began making a list. "I need to change the bed, and send for water so that I can wash. Wine to wash out my mouth. Strong wine. Have a lock fitted to that door to which I have the only key." She looked up to find Xylander staring at her. "You have to go after the girl. It doesn't matter if she's in the castle or if you have to chase her halfway to Flamand. Find her, Lander. Or I am doomed." Xylander glanced back the way Melwis had gone, then looked at Guinevere. "Did he hurt you?" "I swore to defend you, and if he did anything at all, I will slice him into pieces so small no one will know if the body is a man or a pig. I can't leave you here in danger. I swore an oath." Oh, how much she longed to let him stay, to be her loyal bodyguard against that horrible excuse for a man. But if anything happened to the princess, Melwis would be crowned king, and he could have whatever and whoever he wanted. Guinevere could not let that happen. He did nothing. "I am upset about the king's illness and the missing princess," she insisted. "Find the girl. You know what to do." Xylander looked pained, like he knew she lied. "Are you sure?" Heaven help her, why did he tempt her so? Locks and a bath and fresh bedding would see her safe. It had to. "Yes. And do not return until the girl's heart is yours," Guinevere said. 18. Tracking the princess took longer than Xylander expected. Perhaps because he was accustomed to tracking beasts in the forest, where there wasn't such a plethora of paths to follow, as there were outside the city gates. If he hadn't brought one of the palace hunting hounds and a pair of the princess's slippers with him, he suspected he would never have found the trail at all. When her trail left the road to follow a track through the forest, Xylander sent the dog back to the palace and forged on alone. The princess had evidently urged her horse to move swiftly, not an easy thing in the dense forest. A castle-bred girl who'd spent little time in the woods, if she hadn't wanted to be found, she should have kept to the road, where the steady stream of traffic might have hidden her tracks. Instead, she wandered through the forest, circling around one game trail before turning to another, with no clear direction in mind. Almost as if her heart hadn't truly been party to her sudden desire to run away. Not like Guinevere, who had never looked back for a moment. No, not like Guinevere at all. Darkness had fallen by the time he found the princess, and he almost rode over the top of her in the dark. A piercing scream ripped through the night, affrighting his horse, so the mare reared and dumped Xylander unceremoniously on the ground before galloping off. Xylander jumped to his feet, drawing his sword. "Show yourself," he demanded. She pulled off her hood, revealing her pale face. "Please do not hurt me, Sir Knight. Your horse frightened me as much as I frightened him." "Her," Xylander corrected, sheathing his sword. "Like with people, I find female horses are better at doing what needs to be done than male ones. Except when it comes to war." The girl shivered, pulling her cloak more closely about her. "I'm not sure if that's true. Why, I cannot even seem to start a fire." She waved at a pile of branches with no kindling or tinder in sight. Xylander sighed. Why had Guinevere sent him out here to kill the girl? She would perish on her own of exposure without a fire. He could not bring himself to kill someone so helpless. It went against everything he believed in. He would bring Guinevere the girl's heart all right. But it would still be beating, locked in her breast. Oh, such a lovely, sweet breast. All he had to do was persuade the girl to return to the castle where she belonged. He held out his hand for her tinderbox. Please let me. 19. She wasn't hungry, but Guinevere forced down another bite of food without tasting it. She would need all her strength to get through the coming days. You cannot hide in your chamber forever. The people need to see their queen. Lady Ragnar stood inside the room, voicing Guinevere's own thoughts, as she waved a procession of servants through the door. One chest was deposited on the flagstones, the solid thump followed by twin relieved exhalations as the servants released their burdens. A second and third thump followed the first, before all 6 men bowed and departed. Lady Ragnar did not. These are your court clothes, as the king commanded. In his absence the people need their queen. Guinevere stared at the chests. The clothes they contained could only be new, for she had not brought enough from Flamand to fill 1 chest, let alone 3. She could not have commanded enough seamstresses in Flamand to do so much in so little time. But it's only been a day, she said. A day in which you have been crowned queen, the king has been taken ill, and the princess has gone missing. If you mean to be queen for more than a day, you must take your place in the great hall and the throne room on the morrow. Or Lord Melwys will. Lord Melwys, who she could shut out while she stayed here, but she could not avoid if she had to leave her chamber. How one man could frighten her so she wasn't sure, but Guinevere's hands shook at the very thought of him. Lady Ragnar pursed her lips. I will send a maid up in the morning to help you dress for court. If you do not choose a suitable gown, then she will. You are part of King Artorius's family now, and while you might be more familiar with foreign ways, you will do things differently here. The king might be ill, but he will not be dishonored by one such as you. Ragnar left without waiting for a response, which was probably just as well, for the words Guinevere wanted to say were certainly not queenly. Anger forced her to her feet, and all the way to the door, where she considered shouting something after the bully of a chatelaine. Your Majesty. Guinevere blinked as she met Lancelot's eyes before he bowed. Then he straightened again and faced the corridor instead of her. Like a guard, her bewildered mind supplied. He guarded her chamber, just as he'd guarded the royal bedchamber last night. But no mere man could guard against death, which had stolen into the room and felled Artorius as he slept. Death would claim him in the end, for an enchanted sleep could only delay the inevitable. She slammed the door and barred it, wanting to sink to her knees and cry, but this time she knew she could not. Instead, she should busy herself by examining the gowns Ragnar had brought. Guinevere might not like the woman, but she agreed with her that a queen could not hide at dark times such as this. She would not dishonor Artorius, even if he would never know. So she took stock of the gowns Ragnar had brought, laying them one after the other on the bed that she'd had made up with fresh linen after Melway's visit. White linen and wool edged in silk, or a lovely golden fur she'd never seen at home. And the crown jewel of them all, a gold silk gown trimmed with white fur. Ermine, she thought. A gown fit for a queen that outshone even her wedding gown, which she had not yet found. She had only unpacked 2 chests so far, one stood untouched in the corner. The final chest contained her wedding gown as expected, but beneath it was a surfeit of underclothes, white as fresh snow. Stockings and shifts, veils that ranged from thickly woven wool to linen so fine she could see through it when she held it up to the light. And beneath it all sat 2 caskets she had not seen before. She opened the first, and found it full of jewelry. Golden fillets, some jeweled and some plain, though she could hardly call such intricate workmanship plain. Gold lace, woven of fine metal wire instead of thread, formed a crown so light she would barely feel its weight when she wore it. There were necklaces too, but the crown was a work of art. She opened the next casket expecting to see more of the same jewelry, but found it full of silver, not gold. A set of jeweled combs and a set made of plain silver. And beneath those, a mirror, the like of which she'd never seen before. This was a far cry from the scratched bronze in the inn. The silvery surface shone beneath a layer of some sort of crystal or glass, the biggest piece she'd ever seen, an oval bigger than her head. She'd never seen her own reflection so clearly, her skin so pale, making the dark sleepless circles beneath her eyes stand out all the more. What did her appearance matter? What she really wanted to see was her brother, successful in his mission. As if on command, the mirror surface misted over for a moment, before clearing to show a forest in darkness. Guinevere caught a flicker of movement, and peered closer. "Here, let me," she heard Xylander say, as if he was in the room beside her. The rasp of a flint, spitting sparks onto tinder, lit Princess Xylarande's face for a moment before the girl pulled her cloak more closely about herself and backed away. Someone hammered against the door. Guinevere almost dropped the mirror in surprise. "Who is it?" she called. "Lord Melwys wishes to see you, Your Majesty." "Ugh! Tell him I have no desire to see him," she called back. "Open this door. I must see the Queen. It is a private matter of great importance," Melwys demanded. "She would rather die first. I am indisposed. Return on the morrow." The door rattled violently, and she heard Melwys swear. Thankfully, the bar she dropped across it held. "You will regret this, Queen Guinevere," he shouted. She doubted it, but she didn't tell him that. Instead, she busied herself returning her gowns to their places, except for a fawn-colored one trimmed in white silk that seemed the most practical of them all. On the morrow she would wear it to court, as she waited for Xylander to return with the princess. All would be well, she was certain of it. 20. Xylander accepted the bread and cheese Xylander handed to her, though she was more hesitant about the skin of wine. He gulped down some wine to show her it was safe before she sipped from that too. "What is a lady like you doing in the woods? What are you running from?" he asked. Xylander took a larger swallow of wine. "My stepmother's assassins." Xylander choked. Xylander managed a sickly smile. "I know it sounds silly. I said as much to my cousin when he said she would try to kill me, but then I heard her. She was talking to someone, a man, and demanding he bring my heart to her to prove he'd done what she asked. I could not stay in my father's house with her after that. Just waiting for the axe to fall. So I ran." A foolish thing to do for a girl on her own, who had no idea how to survive in the woods. Why didn't you ask someone for help? Find someone to protect you? If she'd come to him first. "My father might have, but he has fallen deathly ill. At my stepmother's hand, if my cousin is to be believed, and I am beginning to think he might be right." Xylander shook his head. No. Guinevere would never have hurt her husband. Not when she relied upon his protection. "What about your cousin? Would he protect you?" Xylander laughed weakly. "He says he can, but for a price. He wants to marry me and claim my father's lands as his own. My father made other plans for me, but if he dies, I fear my prince may never come." She swiped her hands across her face. "You must think me a fool." "No," Xylander lied. "I think you are very brave." That at least was true. To leave her father's castle for the unknown meant she had a great deal of courage. "But I think you would be wiser to seek shelter than to stay out here in the open. Perhaps an inn in the city." He stopped when he saw her shaking her head. "In the city someone will recognize me, and her assassins will find me. I cannot return." Xylander's heart sank. Winning the girl's trust would take too long, and even then, she might still refuse to return to the city with him. He had to try something else. He dug through the pouch at his belt and extracted an apple. The enchanted apple Guinevere had given him. If it put her to sleep, he could carry her back to the city before she woke. "Here, an apple from my father's orchard." "I'd be delighted to share it with you, princess," he said, holding it out. She eyed it suspiciously. Xylander sighed. "He'd have to eat some of this too. Just be careful not to swallow, lest he fall asleep too." He took a bite, then handed the apple to her. Xylander lifted it to her lips, her dark eyes regarding him. He met her gaze, willing her to trust him, but the darkness in her eyes seemed to grow deeper, expanding until blackness engulfed him. 21. Xylander woke slowly, reveling in how well rested he felt. He could not recall how long it had been since he'd slept so well. Why, he could almost imagine himself in his own bed in his father's castle. He was so comfortable. He opened his eyes, and realization dawned. He wasn't home, nor in a bed, and the trees surrounding him seemed to mock him for his stupidity. He'd eaten Guinevere's apple. There was still a piece in his mouth, he hadn't swallowed it. Yet it had enchanted him all the same. He spat it on the ground, cursing as he realized he was alone beside the ashes of a cold fire. No fire, no horse, and no Xylander either. She'd even taken the rest of the bloody apple. Something about the apple must have made her suspicious. Maybe she'd seen that he hadn't swallowed, or maybe she'd recognized him after all. By all that was holy, what did it matter? The girl was gone and he had to find her again. Swearing, he found fresh hoofprints and set off after them. This time, she'd taken a relatively direct route back to the road, surprising him. Had she returned to the city after all? Or headed away from it, taking the road away from everything she'd known, just as he and Guinevere had? A rustling sound drew his attention to the roadside. A horse stepped delicately through the long grass, crunching her way through them. The princess's horse, saddled and bridled but missing her saddlebags. And the princess herself was nowhere to be seen. Xylander swore again. Guinevere would not be happy. Then again, if the girl had slipped away from him, then she was safe. All he had to do was give Guinevere a heart and tell her it was the girl's, and Guin would be satisfied. Xylander headed back into the woods. He would hunt, and then he would go to Guinevere with a heart from whatever he'd killed. And he wouldn't have to kill the princess after all. 22. Several days passed before Guinevere had a chance to peer into the magic mirror again, for even with her minimal magic, she recognized an enchantment when she saw one. She hung the looking glass on the wall on a hook that sat at such a perfect height, it must have been made for it. She stared at her own reflection for a moment, relieved to see the shadows beneath her eyes had not darkened, even after days of presiding over hearings where Sir Dagonet or Sir Lancelot passed judgment, while Melwys glowered at her. That was as close as he'd get to her. She'd barred the door again, and Lancelot stood outside it. Unless Melwys could best the night, which she highly doubted, she would be safe. "Show me my brother," she whispered to the mirror. The surface misted before the forest reappeared. A flickering fire lit the scene, a tableau of butchery if ever she'd seen one. Xylander crouched beside the body of a deer, his arms elbow deep inside the carcass. "Yes," he said suddenly, and freed his arms. In one hand he held a gore-encrusted dagger, and blood streamed from the other, which held what appeared to be the deer's heart. Guinevere's stomach churned. She was no stranger to the sight of blood and slaughter, for as Castle Chatelaine, she'd supervised the killing of the winter's meat stocks for many years now, but something about Xylander's kill reminded her of some ancient pagan ritual, where the so-called priests sacrificed beasts to their myriad deities. She'd heard tell of some remote places in the deep northern forests where such beliefs were still upheld, but surely such things would have died out by now. She was willing to bet Princess Xylander would not be watching such slaughter. Guinevere scanned the clearing, but she did not see the princess. As the girl popped into her head, the image in the mirror blurred, moving too fast to see clearly as it sped away from Xylander. Too far. A tiny cottage came into view, not the sort of place a princess belonged, unless she was visiting one of her father's poorer subjects with charity, as Guinevere herself had occasionally done. Maids who had once served in the castle but were now widows or new mothers, or that time one of the castle shepherds had broken his leg. But this cottage was built half into a hillside, hidden beneath some sort of creeping vine, and no smoke came from the chimney, despite the abundance of wood to feed a fire. A deserted place, surely the princess could not be inside. Guinevere became aware of a rumbling sound. It was a moment before she realized it came not from outside her door but from the mirror. A cart came into view pulled by 4 men. As it slowed to a stop, 3 more men jumped out and began to unload the cart. They passed the sacks hand to hand until they reached the cottage door, which the final man shouldered open. Guinevere held her breath. If the princess truly was inside, this did not bode well for her. As if on command, the mirror image moved to inside the dimly lit cottage. 1 man knelt to light a fire while the rest moved the sacks to the loft. "Hey, who drank all the wine? The jug's empty." The offending jug sat on the table, next to a single cup. "The cheese is gone too. Has anyone seen my winter cloak? 'Tis cold in here without the fire roaring." "Who's that in the bed then?" The men crowded around the edge of the pallet on the floor, staring at someone sleeping face down in the straw. Even dressed in peasant's clothing, Guinevere recognized the princess. "He's wearing my new wool tunic. And my spare one. That's my winter cloak. Aren't those the striped stockings you stole off that tinker at the fair?" "Only because it was dark. What man would wear such womanish stockings?" Silence swept through them for a moment. "There's a girl in our bed. Who gets to have her first then?" A brawl broke out, spilling outside as the tiny cottage could no longer contain the fighting men. Guinevere's heart stuck in her throat. She wanted to reach through the looking glass and pluck the princess from such peril, but she could do nothing but watch. 1 man, bigger than the others, broke away from the fighting to stand in the doorway, looking from the sleeping girl to his still brawling comrades. "I say we wait," he said. The fighting stopped. "Why?" "We only have a few weeks before snow starts to fall and block the passes back to town. Time enough to mine enough salt to see us through the winter, but only if we don't waste any time with whores." "I've never seen a whore like that. She must be one of those courtesans. Rich men's mistresses. With skin white as snow like that. Never mind what she is. She's ours now. Our reward for when winter comes, and whoever minds the most twixt now and then gets her first. What'll we do with her till then?" "Women's work. She can cook and clean for us, and when winter comes, she can warm our beds as well." "What if she refuses?" "Courtesans don't clean stuff. They're like ladies, I heard." "Then we take her to the local lord to be branded as a thief. 2 tunics, a cloak and a jug of wine she's taken so far. And the cheese. Men have been hanged for less. She won't refuse. Not if she wants to live. But if she wants to take her chances with the local lord?" The big man laughed. "Then we don't wait. We each take her and then take what's left to Lord Melwis. That lord isn't lenient to thieving whores." He gestured to one of the others. "Wake her up. Time to make her an offer." Guinevere watched in horror as one of the men shook Xylander awake. The girl let out a shrill scream and backed up against the wall. The big man made his offer, that they'd let her stay with them if she did the cooking and cleaning. Guinevere wanted to scream at the girl to run, to get away while she could, but the terrified princess merely nodded her acceptance. Guinevere cursed. Where was her brother? 23. When Xylander reached the city, he debated whether to visit an inn to make himself look respectable again before he visited the castle. But without even a change of clothes, he doubted he could do much. Besides, Guinevere would not care what state he was in, as long as he brought good news. He lingered in the inn long enough to buy a stoppered jug of wine to preserve the heart, before heading up to the castle. Guinevere sat in the throne room, alone on the dais, while a knight dispensed justice in the king's name. When his eyes met hers, she beckoned to the knight, who declared the day's audience at an end. Guinevere headed out of the throne room, and Xylander followed, all the way to the private apartments where she'd stayed before she married the king. "Where have you been?" she hissed, slamming the door shut behind him. Xylander bridled. "Why, doing your business, my queen?" He sketched a mocking bow, then held out the stoppered wine jug. "As you commanded." She stared at the jug. "What would I want wine for? What of the princess?" Xylander uncorked the jug and drew out the dripping heart. The wine sheeting off it almost looked like blood. Her heart, as promised. Guinevere's mouth dropped open in horror. "Don't lie to me. I saw you kill that deer. How could you leave the princess in the woods like that?" Xylander dropped the heart back in the jug. Wine splashed across his tunic, but he ignored it. "How could you know that?" "Show me the princess," Guinevere hissed, pointing at a mirror on the wall. The mirror misted, swirled, then showed an astonishingly clear picture that was not a reflection of the room. "How?" he began. Guinevere hushed him. "Listen and look." He peered at the looking-glass and swore. Xylander sat on a rough stool beside a smoky fire, weeping into her hands. When she lifted her head, he saw the dark shadow of a bruise across half her face, as if someone had hit her. "The bread will be better tomorrow. I promise." "Please don't hit me again," she whimpered. Fury rose up. Who had dared strike his princess? "Why in heaven's name did you leave her with those criminals and bring me a heart to make me think she was dead?" Guinevere demanded. Xylander stared. "You asked for her heart." Guinevere stamped her foot. "You fool. I told you to win her heart. You know, make her fall in love with you so she won't marry Lord Melwys, the king's slimy cousin." "Win her? Why hadn't she said so?" "But you left her in a cottage with criminals. They're stealing salt from one of the king's mines and selling it, and they mean to take her too, treating her like a servant for now, but they have a wager. Whoever can mine the most salt before the first snowfall will make her his whore." Xylander's mouth dropped open and he couldn't seem to close it. Words failed him. "Go and find her, you fool, and save her before it's too late." Xylander hurried off, staying in the city only long enough to procure fresh clothes and provisions and a new horse, before he returned to the clearing where he'd last seen Xylander. This time he would follow the hoofprints until he found what he'd missed the first time, signs of where Xylander had gone. He would not fail her this time. 24. By all that was holy, what had Xylander been thinking? That she wanted the girl dead? If she had, she'd have asked for the princess's head, not her heart. As if she'd ask for anyone's head. What sort of mad queen would demand such a thing? And that dripping heart, Guinevere shuddered. She might not be squeamish at the sight of blood, but when he'd pulled the organ out of that wine jug, red with wine or blood or a mixture of both, why, she'd challenge even the strongest man not to shrink away at such a sight. It would churn anyone's stomach. Except Xylander's, of course. They'd called him the huntsman for a reason back home. When he'd splashed gore down his front from it, he barely blinked. She hoped he hadn't splashed any, Guinevere swore under her breath. There were 2 distinctive red splatters on her white skirt, and a scatter of droplets on her bodice too. She would have to change gowns or appear in court looking like a sloppy serving wench. Slipping out of her soiled gown was the easy part, but lacing up a new one was harder than she'd expected. She'd never needed a maid when they were laced along the front or the side, but this benighted bloody thing had to be laced up the back. She dropped the golden gown on the bed, then realized the stain had gone through to her underthings. She needed a clean shift too. She pulled the fresh linen out of its chest just as the door slammed open. "I will see the traitorous whore, and you shall not stand in my way," Melwas roared as he strode in. Guinevere clutched her shift to her chest, painfully aware of her nakedness as Melway's greedy eyes took her in. "Whore," Melwas repeated, pointing an accusing finger at her. "I saw your lover leaving. The guards will catch him and wring a confession out of him, I have no doubt. As for you, you are no more a queen than the lowliest tavern whore, spreading your legs for every common knight." From the way his eyes lit up, he looked like he was fairly drooling over the thought. "Xylander is most certainly not my lover," she said, drawing herself up. She longed to dress, to put layers of wool and linen and maybe even armor between her body and Melway's lair, but she didn't dare move her shift and expose herself to him. Or Lancelot, who stood behind him with a thunderous expression on his face. "Take this lying warmongering whore to the dungeons," Melwas ordered. "Whatever else she may be, she is the queen and our sovereign," Lancelot said steadily. "Her guilt is for the king to judge, not you or I. Her lover flees the castle while she stands here naked as her name day while the king lies dying in his own chamber. The king will not live to judge her, she'll make sure of that." Melwas glared. "You saw the answer her father sent. The head of the king's own messenger, with his tongue cut out. King Artorius sent the man a messenger to inform him of their union, but all he received back was a declaration of war. That whore is responsible, I know it." Guinevere's heart sank. Her father truly had gone mad, if he cared so little about offending his neighbors, that he was willing to execute their messengers. Lancelot's eyes met hers, cold blue pools that would show her no mercy. "Your Majesty, Lord Melwas accuses you of grave crimes indeed. Until your innocence or guilt can be proven before the king or his duly appointed judge, I must ask you to remain in your chambers, and a guard will stand outside. If I do not do this, the king will never forgive me. Do you agree to remain in your chambers, my queen?" "She is a criminal and she belongs in the dungeons," Melwas raged. Lancelot's gaze never wavered. "Your answer, my queen?" She blew out a breath she'd barely been aware she was holding. "I will stay here. Until my husband wakes. If by some miracle he woke." Tears formed, threatening to spill, but she held her head high. These men had seen enough. Neither of them would see her cry. "And my condolences for your messenger. If I'd had any idea my father would do such a thing." She didn't want to believe it, but in her heart she did. He truly had gone mad. Lancelot bowed low. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Now we will see ourselves out." He seized Melway's arm and dragged the protesting lord out of the room, kicking the door shut behind him. Guinevere sagged. She'd panicked so when they burst into her room, she hadn't thought to defend herself. She should have showed them her wine-stained gown, explained that Lander was her brother, the son of a mad king who was now their enemy. No, she could not tell them about Lander at all, unless he returned with the princess. She dressed mechanically, and it wasn't until she was done that she realized she'd donned the plainest gown she'd brought from home. The soft, oft-washed linen was comforting, reminding her of happier times. But not comforting enough. She buried her head in her hands and wept. For 2 kingdoms at war, for a beloved father gone mad, for the life of a loyal servant lost, for a loving husband fallen before she could truly know him, for the princess in peril, and perhaps even a tear or two for herself and the uncertainty her future held. 25. For the 3rd time, Xylander returned to the clearing where he'd lit the fire for Xurine. Rain had erased her horse's tracks, along with any signs of her passage. He hated to admit it, but he'd lost her. How could he save her now? No matter how much he wanted to. Not even a hunting dog would help him now, for the same rain that had taken her footprints had surely washed away her scent too. He would retrace the path her horse had taken on its own, then return to town, and ask Guinevere for her magic mirror. If it could show her the princess in some distant cottage, then surely it could show him the path the princess had taken to get there. He trudged along the muddy trail, wishing she'd left at least something for him to follow. Hadn't there been some ancient princess who'd given a hero a spool of thread to find his way out of a labyrinth? Wait, was that a thread? Not the sort to lead him out of a labyrinth, for it was no longer than his finger, but what drew his attention was that it was white wool, spun wool, which could only have come from someone's clothing. Xylander had been wearing a gown of white wool beneath her black cloak, a snow-white maiden indeed, the fairest he'd ever seen. And he would again if he could but follow her trail and find her. He plucked the thread from the bush that had caught it, and stuck it in his pocket. There was a game trail here, that widened considerably on the other side of the bush. Almost as if someone had hidden it deliberately. The rain had not washed away the signs of deep ruts made from heavily laden carts that had once passed through here. Guinevere's illegal miners, maybe? He hastened along the cart track, for that's what it had become, until he happened upon a lady's slipper. Once white, it was now so caked in mud he barely recognized it as Xylander's, but who else but a castle-bred princess would wear such a shoe out here? 500 yards further, he found the second shoe, half hidden under a thorn bush that held no less than 3 white threads, including one as long as his arm. She had passed this way for certain. All he had to do was find her and save her. A fitting quest for a noble knight. Maybe even a prince. 26. I must interrogate the prisoner. Every night Melwis appeared at the door of her chamber, and each night he uttered the same demand. But the guards would not allow him to enter, to Guinevere's endless relief. Until tonight. Yes, Lord Regent, but you say she is a witch who has cast a spell over the king. What if she were to do the same to you? I am immune to magic. I have a charm that wards me against evil such as hers. Let me see that. There was a long pause followed by, you should send your guards to arrest whoever sold that to you, Lord Regent, for it is about as magical as my left arse cheek. Later. What matters is this traitor, and I must interrogate her now. Very well, Lord Regent. As the door swung open, Guinevere rose to stand before the mirror, hiding it from sight. She couldn't bear to see poor Xylander enslaved to those monsters, so she rarely looked at it, except to follow her brother's search, but she did not want Melwis to notice it and take it from her. Or Lancelot, who claimed to be able to sense magic. She met his expressionless eyes as he stood behind Melwis. Melwis made to shut the door, but he could not with Lancelot in the way. Move, man, I must speak to her alone. Melwis insisted, rubbing his groin as he turned fever-bright eyes on Guinevere. For your own protection I cannot allow that, Lancelot said, folding his arms across his chest. This girl is no danger to me. Melwis strode toward Guinevere. She backed away from him until her shoulders touched cold stone and could go no further. Still he advanced. She turned her face away. His hand closed around her throat. You see, Lancelot? She knows who's in charge here. King Artorius, my husband, she choked out. Melway's hand squeezed, cutting off her air. What did you do to him, witch? Undo the spell you cast on our beloved king, and perhaps I will let you live. I did nothing, she said. He slammed her head against the wall so hard her vision exploded into stars for a moment. Lying whore. Then he slapped her face. Guinevere tasted blood. The magic within her roared to be released, to defend her, but she forced it down. If she cast a spell, they would know her to be a witch, and she would seal her fate for sure. "I swear on my life I did nothing to hurt the king," she managed to say. "Faithless Flemish bitch." Melwys shoved his body against hers, pinning her to the wall. "Tell the truth and I will let you live. Continue to lie, and you'll wish you had taken my offer." He ground his hips against her, the hardness between them pressing against her belly. Billa rose up in her throat. "I never," she began, but he slapped her a second time so hard her head rang. Her lip stung, as if she'd cut it. He grinned at her, running a finger over her lip. It came away bloody. "You'll bleed far more for me, bitch. Just like the queen before you. So much you'll beg to die just like she did." He sucked his bloodied finger. Then his eyes rolled up in his head and he keeled over, snoring. Guinevere's eyes met Lancelot's knowing ones. He knew she'd cast a sleeping spell. "Guards!" he shouted. She shrank away to the corner furthest from the door and the downed Melwys, wishing she could disappear entirely. The guards arrived, panting and wide-eyed as they took in the sight of their quailing queen and the regent in repose. "Pick up the Lord Regent and carry him to his bedchamber," Lancelot instructed. "No man is to enter the queen's chamber alone." The men did as they were bidden, shooting frightened glances at Guinevere. When Lancelot alone stood in the doorway, she dared to step out of the shadows. Smoothing her skirts to disguise how much her hands shook, she lifted her eyes to meet his. Her husband's most loyal, honorable knight knew her secret now. She had nothing left to hide. He regarded her for a long moment, almost as if he was daring her to bespell him as she had Melwys. Magic had been forced out of her once, but she had better control over it now. "If I had the power to heal him I would," she said softly. "King Artorius, I mean. Not Melwys." Sir Lancelot inclined his head. "I will send your maids with hot water so that you might bathe. I will stand guard over your chamber tonight. Sleep well." And he left, closing the door behind him. A bath. How had he known she'd want to wash off Melway's touch? Surely the man could not read minds. Few men could use magic, and she hadn't sensed any in him. Not even in his left arse cheek, as he'd so coarsely put it. She smothered a laugh. Now she'd be thinking about the knight's backside, instead of worrying about what he'd do now he knew she was a witch. 27. He found Zurin's camp by mid-afternoon. There was evidence of a fire. She'd watched him more carefully than he'd realized that night they'd spent in the woods together, and he found the wax rind of the cheese they'd shared. He could keep going or make camp as she had. If he knew she was close by, that he'd reach her by nightfall, he would have continued on without hesitation. But he didn't know how long she'd wandered until she'd found the cottage, or the cottage inhabitants had found her. She could still be days away, and he'd be no use to her if he arrived without having slept. Fighting one man he might manage, but 7 of them? Hardened miners might not be fighters, but they knew where to strike a blow and how to make it a good one. A man who could split rock could split bone and flesh with ease. 7 of them, he would need a plan. Because he would save Zurin or die trying. And he did not intend to die. No, he had too much living to do. 28. Guinevere's days blended into a monotony where she had little to do, other than stare at the mirror. She only knew a new day had dawned when the guard outside her door changed color, for the knights wore their bright surcoats while on guard duty as well as at court. Warned by Lancelot not to speak to her lest she try to bespell them as well, none of the knights would meet her eyes or offer their names, so she named them for their blazons. The knight with a lying down lion was Sleepy, while the knight who bore a serpent twisted about a staff was the physician. A different guard for each day of the week, until Lancelot returned to stand guard. Though she knew his name, she found herself thinking of him as Grumpy. Not for the fine sword embroidered on his breast, but for the thunderous expression on his face whenever he saw her. Whatever approval he'd had for her at first, it had faded fast, replaced by his barely concealed anger as he watched the maidservants bring her food or clean her chamber. "I am not responsible for the king's illness," she declared to him one morning. He raised surprised eyes to meet hers for a moment, before looking away again. Nettled, she added, "Nor am I unfaithful." He winced, though he did not meet her eyes again. She stamped her foot. "Look at me, damn you! Look in my eyes and see I'm telling the truth. You must believe me. I have done nothing to harm your king." Lancelot sighed and raised his head. "It matters not what I believe, your majesty. It is the king's judgment that matters, and until he is well enough to hold court, or the crown passes to another, I will do as I have always done. I will serve my king and his kingdom." He hadn't spoken to her since. Not that it mattered. Xylander journeyed through the forest day after day, but he had not yet reached the princess. The castle grew colder, and she knew the first winter snows were not far off. She could only pray that her brother reached the princess first.